go to the Department of Transportation.
Hello, my name is Heather Hildebrandt with NCDOT. I am the statewide initiative supervisor.
Good morning. Next, we'll go to the Department of Public Safety.
Good morning. This is Doug Holbrook. I'm the Secretary's designee for the Department of Public Safety, comprising the Division of Prisons, other adult corrections, juvenile justice, highway patrol, and emergency management and resiliency office.
Good morning, Doug. Next, we'll go to the Department of Administration.
Good morning. I'm Robert Riddle. I'm the Director of the Division of Motor Fleet Management, and I should be here with Mark Edwards, who I believe is our interim Secretary of the Department of Administration.
Okay, good morning. Department of Natural and Cultural Resources.
Good morning, this is Dean Eatman. I'm the Legislative Affairs Director and Policy Advisor for the department. We're in a little bit of a transition like several other agencies right now, with a new secretary just taking over, and then hopefully a new chief deputy over our natural divisions coming in before too long, and that person will probably be taking the designee role over at that point. So just glad to be here and listen along.
Welcome. Department of Health and Human Services.
Yeah, good morning, Iris Cooper. I'm the DHHS designee to this council, and in my day job, I'm the Assistant Secretary for Procurement Contracts and Grants for DHHS.
Good morning, Iris. The Department of Military and Veterans Affairs.
Yes, my name is Chris Moore, and I am the Installation Coordinator for the Department of Military and Veteran Affairs. I am happy to be a part of this meeting.
Good morning. Anyone from Department of Revenue?
Good morning. From the Department of Revenue, Angela Altice, Assistant Secretary of Business Services and Support. I'm the Secretary's designee.
Okay, good morning. And I'm sorry if I forgot anyone. Please announce yourself and your agency.
Good morning. My name is Ariel Christensen, and I'm with North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services as well. I'm an environmental epidemiologist.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll get started to our agenda item 2. Jeremy, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Sushma. Again, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this Climate Council meeting. Our first, for the next hour, we're going to cover a number of different transportation topics. The first one being the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is called TCI for shorthand. In December last year, Governor Cooper joined 11 other governors to sign a joint statement committing to continued collaboration and individual state actions to equitably reduce air pollution, create healthier communities, and invest in cleaner transportation. North Carolina committed to help develop a model rule with other states for reducing emissions from the transportation sector and boost our economic recovery. And we committed to conduct public outreach to ensure that emission reductions and public health and economic opportunities benefit underserved communities. Last December, some states committed to launch the TCI program. We wanted to take more time to consider the program and to get stakeholder feedback on the program. And to that end, we have invited James Bradbury, the Mitigation Program Director at Georgetown Climate Center, to this meeting. James is going to provide a summary of the TCI process and program, and we will have a few minutes when he's finished to answer questions from the council and the public. If you would like to ask a question, please send your question to me in the chat, or the presenter or the host, whatever you see. Please type your question in the chat box. If we're not able to get to all questions during this session, please feel free to reach out to Jennifer Munt at North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality if you have questions or feedback about TCI, again, that we weren't able to address. With that, James, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Good morning, Jeremy. Thank you very much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here today. And thank you to the Interagency Council for this opportunity to share updates on TCI. Next slide, please. So as Jeremy just explained, generally TCI is a regional collaboration of Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and now Southeast jurisdictions. All of these jurisdictions have ambitious economy-wide greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, and with transportation accounting for over 40% of carbon emissions across the region, there's a wide recognition that more needs to be done to cut pollution from the transportation sector. Georgetown Climate Center, for our part, we provide facilitation, we conduct research, and generally help to support states' ongoing climate policy efforts through TCI and on other initiatives as well. December 2018 marked really the first major milestone for TCI when 9 states and DC announced their intent to design a regional approach to capping carbon emissions from transportation. And then the next major milestone came at the end of last year when, as Jeremy mentioned, December 2020, the governors of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, and the mayor of DC signed a memorandum of understanding to launch the TCI program, or TCIP. And those are the yellow jurisdictions on the map in front of you. I'm sure you know where they are, but that's just to help orient you with the visual. Also in December 2020, as Jeremy also mentioned, there was an accompanying statement supported by the states shown in light blue, signaling intention to continue working on the development of TCIP, including the draft model rule, which I'll come back to later. Next slide, please. So on page 1 of the Memorandum of Understanding, the signatory jurisdictions commit to the following program goals. And I think these are generally shared by all the jurisdictions, but this is what was solidified in the MOU. And they're listed here on the screen: reduce carbon emissions from transportation, improve air quality and public health, provide more affordable access to transportation choices, promote local economic opportunity and create high quality jobs, helping with economic recovery, maximize the efficiency of the program. And just to be clear, that can be accomplished by the investment part of cap and invest. The more investments are made in low carbon transportation, that helps bring costs down and make the whole program overall more efficient. And the final goal, last but not least, is to advance equity for communities overburdened by pollution and underserved by the transportation system. Next slide, please. So how will the Cap and Invest program work? This slide provides sort of a high-level introduction and orientation to that. So TCIP reduces carbon emissions from diesel and gasoline sold in participating jurisdictions. Cap and Invest has worked well in this region in the past, helping to reduce carbon emissions from the power sector through RGGI. So it's pretty similar to that, but for transportation, RGGI being the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So for this program, reductions are achieved in 2 parts. First, by capping and reducing total emissions from the fuels and selling allowances for the pollution from those fuels sold by regulated fuel suppliers. And the proceeds from the sale of those allowances are used to invest in low carbon transportation strategies that give communities and workers, businesses, additional transportation options. So the cap and the invest parts of the program work together and both act to reduce emissions. Both are important. A couple other details just at the bottom of this slide: that in the MOU, it specifies that emissions reporting will begin next year in 2022, and the cap will go into effect in 2023. Any jurisdictions that join after 2022 could start with the allowance compliance requirements right away in 2023 or any year thereafter. But this is the timeline that the signatory jurisdictions are on board with. Another really important fundamental aspect of this is, while it's a multi-jurisdictional program, each jurisdiction that participates decides how to invest its share of the program proceeds from the auction of allowances. Next slide, please. So I was asked to share some of the modeling that was conducted to inform TCIP program design. So the next few slides will do that and hopefully also orient you to what the program aims to achieve and how it would achieve it, reiterating some of the points I just made. So this first slide illustrates projected emissions from on-road diesel and motor gasoline fuels that would be covered under the TCI program, assuming all jurisdictions across the region participate. And the modeling we did was for Virginia to Maine, all the jurisdictions in the region. North Carolina joined the process later, and we were not able to incorporate North Carolina into the modeling. But these the general outcomes we expect would be quite similar if North Carolina was added. So the first point here, just to orient you on this graph, the updated reference case, that's the black line, shows where transportation emissions are expected to trend in the absence of a TCI program. Again, that's in black. The gray shading above the black line shades the area between our original reference case that we have been modeling for TCI and the new updated reference case. And that reflects reductions that we would expect to result from complementary policies advanced by the Biden-Harris administration, including more aggressive CAFE standards, post-2025, incentives for electric vehicles as well, also a commitment by the administration, which are equivalent to lower electric vehicle prices, which is how we modeled it. So the green line shows the 26% reduction in emissions that would be achieved as a result of the TCI policy, and that would be from 2022 to 2032. That's on the graph, the 26% shown there. And the steepest dashed line is the cap trajectory as defined by the MOU. This declines by 30%. So you'll hear this 30% cap reduction in the policy program description sometimes. And that's from 2023 to 2032. And that is really the mechanism, of course, along with the investments for achieving program reductions through 2032. This you'll notice starts a little above the reference case to accommodate projected COVID-related changes in emissions as a result of lower gas prices, lower transit ridership in the near term. So just to be clear, while the cap may start slightly above where modeled projected emissions would be in 2023, due to the fact that allowance banking is allowed by regulated entities, the green line still represents our best estimate of projected emissions. And most importantly, the net impact, incremental impact of the program on emissions for the first 10 years of the program. That's the takeaway. Next slide, please. So in order to model the effects of the cap and invest program, first you have to choose the cap levels you want to assess, and that's what the previous slide was about. You also have to make assumptions about how the proceeds from the program will be invested. As I noted, each jurisdiction will ultimately have discretion regarding how to invest its portion of allowance auction proceeds, and every state will make its own determinations with input from the public and so forth. But for the purposes of the modeling, TCI jurisdictions developed an illustrative investment portfolio to feed in the model, and that's what we're looking at here on the slides. The TCI investment strategy tool that we used includes 25 different low carbon transportation strategy types, from incentives for the purchase of electric vehicles, that's at the top of the chart of the table on the right, to various types of investments in transit systems, to pedestrian and bike infrastructure. So for the 30% cap reduction scenario and this illustrative investment portfolio, the model estimates that TCIP would generate an average of $2 billion annually for the entire modeled region, again, from Virginia to Maine. A couple quick points just to give you a sense of scale here. So the modeling estimated that by 2032, incentives from the program could result in the deployment of an additional 24,000 electric transit and school buses, cumulatively across the region, and nearly as many electric medium-duty trucks, again, cumulatively over the decade. Another point, sort of for a sense of scale, the total proceeds of the the VW settlement distributed among TCI jurisdictions was just over $700 million. And that was a one-time thing. And what we're looking at here are annual figures. Oh, and I think I didn't mention, but it's on your screen. If we had included North Carolina in the modeling, we expect that the proceeds for North Carolina would be roughly $300 million per year, kind of on average over the course of the decade that we modeled. Next slide, please. So we also took outputs from the analysis I just introduced and used that to conduct macroeconomic modeling using REMI, a model you may be familiar with. Overall, TCI is projected to have a net positive impact on GDP, income, and jobs, and this was true for all of the cap reduction investment scenarios that we modeled for TCI. Of course, the program has modest costs as well. Carbon prices projected to start at about $6.50 a ton, which are incurred by the regulated fuel suppliers and would flow through the economy. But the net benefits of the program are projected to outweigh those costs and grow over time. This is because businesses and individuals save money from reduced overall fuel expenditures. That's the big one. Also lower congestion, as consumers have other options for transportation that reduces road congestion, and that has savings for individuals and businesses. And also electric vehicles, for example, have lower overall vehicle operating and maintenance costs. And I'll just note, we say modest and I keep emphasizing modest here because the program is not really very large compared to the size of the overall economy. So regional GDP is projected to grow to over $6 trillion by 2032, comparing that to a $2 billion a year program. But the bottom line is that the policy can help spur economic growth and also, importantly, help participating jurisdictions achieve their climate goals based on the analysis that we've done. Next slide, please. So helping with economic recovery, very important. Also, of course, public health is an important consideration, particularly as we all work to recover from this pandemic. And here again, we expect benefits. This analysis on the screen, your screen here, is based on an independent work by a Harvard-led consortium of academic institutions, as referenced at the bottom of the slide. The bottom line here is that as we take steps to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from transportation, we also would expect substantial benefits for public health. And those benefits come from three main factors. First, of course, reductions in particulate matter and other pollution from cars and trucks, which are big contributors to asthma and other diseases. There's of course, a benefit when you reduce those emissions. This accounts for part of the 320 premature deaths avoided and the thousands of fewer incidents from childhood asthma. Also, giving people more transportation options helps to reduce traffic congestion. As I noted, this makes streets safer for pedestrians. And not shown here, but we estimate that this would help to save dozens of lives and hundreds of major injuries annually by 2032. And of course, when it's safer to walk and bike and transit services are improved, people take advantage of those options. And that means more people experience the health benefits of physical activity. And all told, monetized estimated annual health benefits by 2032 would be over $3.2 billion and considerably more than the total level of annual TCIP investments. Next slide, please. Of course, in the end and in reality, the proceeds, how the proceeds are invested will make a huge difference for how many of these estimated benefits will be realized and also how those benefits will be distributed. So that is a key point. TCI states have heard loud and clear from stakeholders in the public that the program needs to center equity and prioritize addressing the needs of environmental justice frontline communities. The final MOU responds directly to these concerns in several important ways, which are outlined here and a bit also on the next slide. First of all, the MOU commits to a minimum of 35% of the proceeds to be targeted toward investments that benefit overburdened and underserved communities. Also, there's a commitment to equitable processes to ensure that communities can provide meaningful input in decision-making processes, and that's more on that on the next slide. The third bullet here on transparency, MOU also commits to annual reporting on the equity impacts of the program in addition to air quality monitoring to ensure that the benefits are realized for underserved and overburdened communities from an air quality perspective. And finally, complementary policies, which will of course vary from state to state, but would include, for example, air quality monitoring, as I mentioned, vehicle emission standards, port electrification initiatives. There could be a lot of additional measures taken that can really help ensure that diesel emissions, for example, decline in communities overburdened by pollution. Next slide. Another important commitment of the MOU is for each jurisdiction to create or designate equity advisory bodies, which would be standing groups made up of representatives from underserved and overburdened communities to help guide the program implementation, again, on an ongoing basis. MOU specifies that the purpose of these groups will be to identify criteria for defining underserved and overburdened communities, recommend investments and complementary policies that would meet community needs, and help determine how progress is measured, the metrics being a very important consideration with respect to equity, so we know who's benefiting from the program and how. The next slide, I'll be brief on this, being mindful of time, before the last couple slides are really overview of next steps. I just wanted to emphasize that TCI really may work best as part of a comprehensive set of climate policies. Transportation emissions are often referred to as a three-legged stool. You have the vehicles, the fuels, and then the vehicle miles traveled. And different climate policies at different levels of government are needed to address these emissions. Some of them are already in place, like federal standards, for example. This slide just references a few federal and state strategies, mostly to address vehicles and VMT. But the point here is that TCI can be adaptable. That's, I think, one of the benefits of the program as designed. The overall cap on emissions is important to help ensure that your emission reduction goals are met. Meanwhile, the state investments in low carbon transportation can be targeted wherever they're most needed at any given time, to increase opportunities through transportation, improve air quality, through programs that cut emissions from vehicles, fuels, or from VMT. And then I will, last couple slides. The next slide, please. So just to wrap up, this slide highlights that as a multi-jurisdictional program, TCIP has both regional and state-specific processes, and public input will be invited and really is needed throughout. The next step in the regional process is the release of a draft model rule, and that'll actually happen next Monday, March 1st, along with a public webinar featuring other TCI-related updates. The model rule it has been developed with input from all TCI jurisdictions. It serves as a common framework for each participating jurisdiction to develop its own regulations and implement the TCI program within each individual participating jurisdiction, and together as a whole, they make up the regional program, similar to RGGI. And also, as with RGGI, again, the power sector, sort of comparable program, there's program review that occurs every few years, and that's another regional process. But as for state-specific processes that North Carolina would control if you were to decide to participate, there are a few additional steps on the road to implementation, setting up the equity advisory bodies, any legislative processes as needed, state rulemaking processes, which of course would have public input periods, public comment periods, planning for investments, which would of course happen on an ongoing basis, and finally annual reports, as I mentioned, for transparency. And the final slide is just another way of looking at these process steps of TCI implementation that we just walked through from the perspective of upcoming milestones as well as processes that'll be ongoing over time. The rectangles are the upcoming milestones for participating jurisdictions. We're currently at the model rule development stage. That's the orange circle. And the arrows represent ongoing processes for public engagement, including equity advisory bodies, program reviews, and then auction proceeds and investments. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
James, thank you so much. We have about 5 minutes and for any questions that folks may have. Climate Council, let me start with you. If you have any questions or comments. And I think the way to handle this would be if you can unmute yourself, or if you need help Matthew or Sushma can help you do that. But want to give you a first chance to ask any questions or make any comments. While we're pausing for the Climate Council, folks, other attendees, if you have questions, please use the chat function and we'll try to get to those. Hearing none, we do have one question from an attendee asking what legislative processes or issues might be expected or needed. In many states, I think the states are still evaluating what sort of the regulatory pathway would be in each particular state, what legislative processes or needs would need to happen in order to move forward with TCI. So those are also questions that we're looking at and considering in North Carolina. Again, welcome any feedback on things that the state should be thinking about as we consider TCI.
I'll just note, of course, that's similar for all the jurisdictions involved. It's going to vary state by state.
Matthew, are we getting any other? Oh, here we go. James, if you could take this one. What is the timeline for auction proceeds and investments?
Good question. So the program starts with reporting, as I noted, emissions reporting in 2022 for those signatory jurisdictions are working toward that. And then the cap goes into effect in 2023, but the MOU does indicate that early auctions may occur. So halfway through, they're expected to be quarterly auctions. And so there could be up to 2 early auctions in 2022, at which point the proceeds from those auctions would flow to the jurisdictions that are implementing the program. Again, as soon as 2022.
Thanks. I just want to remind folks that Sushma, if I could just maybe have you answer to make sure I get it right. Is this session being recorded, and will it be available online for folks to view who may not be able to view the whole Climate Council meeting today?
We do record all of our meetings, but I want to confirm with Matthew since we had a little bit of hiccup this morning.
Yes, this meeting is being recorded.
All of our council from beginning to end are posted on our website for later viewing.
Great. Well, James, thank you so much for your time and presenting on TCI. It's really helpful as we sort of consider the program and to just help level set so we understand more what the program is and what some of the decision points are.
Thank you, and great to have North Carolina at the table and what's the development of the program. Thank you for your interest.
So next we'll move to our section of the agenda about for a state motor fleet update. You may recall that in Executive Order 80, the governor directed all cabinet agencies to use zero emission vehicles whenever feasible. And so I'm going to turn over to Rob Riddle, who is the Director of Motor Fleet Management at the North Carolina Department of Administration, and he's going to give us an update on where the state is with respect to transition of the state motor fleet to zero emission vehicles. Take it away, Rob.
Hey, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for having me here today. I am Robert Riddle. I am the Director of the Division of Motor Fleet Management. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing, what's been done, and so I'm going to run through a couple things today. A status of our EVs in our fleet, some of the suitability assessment studies that we've done that are ongoing, talk about charging of our state's fleet, some education that's being done, and kind of some next steps. So I'm going to run through that. It's going to go pretty quick. But I hope Mark Edwards is here to help me too. I know he was trying to get in. I'm pretty sure he's here. But let's go to the next slide. I want to talk about the status of where we are with EVs in the fleet. Motor Fleet's going through some integration of EVs in our fleet, and it's happened over time. We started with none and have worked our way to 2020, where you can see our numbers that we currently have right now with EVs in our fleet. And daily, weekly, we make replacements to our fleet. And as those replacements are made, we have a conversation with our agencies about the suitability of a EV for the purpose of the replacement vehicle. And the fleet's just going to continue to grow with EVs. And these are our numbers that this is just a right now snapshot. Next slide, please. And this is more of the right now. Right now, we say, where are these vehicles? We see the numbers, but where are they and who's using them? This is a list of all the current makes and models of EVs and our hybrid vehicles that we have and where they're assigned. Our university partners are big users of our fleet EVs, and we'd like to see our cabinet agencies creep up with those numbers. So we're making recommendations where we can. The universities have done a lot of investing in charging infrastructure. I think they're ahead of the curve here for the state. But DPS is making gains for the state of North Carolina. The Department of Public Safety, Environmental Quality, and DHHS have recently been making gains in investing in infrastructure and requesting vehicles. So we're just going to continue to grow the EV fleet. But this is a status of where we are right now, Jeremy, and Climate Council. So next slide. Let's talk about what we do with the fleet. And I guess I didn't mention the size of the fleet. I'll mention it. The size of our fleet, we have about 7,000 plus vehicles in the fleet that serve a variety of uses for our agency partners. But so what we've done and the way that we are approaching suitability to try to decide, can we implement an EV as a solution for a vehicle when we're assigning it, is we partnered with Saltwatch Labs, who has analyzed our data and helped us develop some suitability assessment standards. And in 2019, we did a suitability assessment with Saltwatch, and we identified 572 vehicles that might be suitable for replacement with an EV. And that is an ongoing conversation with our agency partners. Those 572 vehicles, not all of them were due for replacement, last year. So we are on a replacement schedule, and when those vehicles do come up for replacement, the conversation will be had are, hey, this vehicle looks like the routes it drives, the usage that it goes on its daily routes. It looks like it could go a full day with a single charge. It parks overnight in a consistent location. These vehicles would be the optimal vehicle to replace with an EV. So as we continue replacing vehicles over the life cycle of those vehicles, we're again going to be growing the EVs in our fleet. When we did the 2019 analysis, we really studied, tried to pick, at that time we didn't have a full implementation of telematics on our vehicles, so we couldn't study the entire fleet. And also at that time, we really wanted to target sort of low-hanging fruit. So we targeted what we perceived to be sedans that could be easily replaced with EVs. And so we targeted specific vehicles that we knew had good data for telematics to study. And we're very fortunate to have been chosen. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, as part of the Department of Energy, picked North Carolina to be one of the states that, because of our telematics that we have, to fund a complete study of our entire fleet this year. We're waiting for that analysis to come back from Saltwatch again. It's going to be a redo of the 2019 suitability assessment that we did. And we're going to get a new look at our fleet again, the entire fleet, because we have telematics on everything at this point in time. It'll be curious to see how COVID has impacted some of this data, or if they were able to capture data pre-COVID to help us, with parking analysis. And we're expecting that information any day now. We don't have it yet, but we were told mid-February it would be ready. And so we're a little bit past mid-February, and at any point in time. Now we're expecting to hear from NREL and SawWatch and have a new study to look at, which will then lead to conversations about, let's go to the next slide, please. It'll lead to renewed conversations with looking for charging solutions, because the real need for the state of North Carolina agencies is to invest in charging infrastructure and to have charging infrastructure in locations where vehicles park overnight. Motor Fleet, we've done some charging infrastructure here on our site. We have vehicles. Back at the beginning, it looked like we had some vehicles that were unassigned that are EVs. We use those vehicles here as loaner vehicles to drivers that may need service. They'll come in for service with their regular car, and we ship them out with an EV as a loaner vehicle when their car is being serviced here. And it's a good way for us to build some goodwill and to get kind of some EV utilization into the fleet of drivers who may not normally have ever been in an EV or used EV. So we put infrastructure here at Motor Fleet, but we've also worked with WEX, which is our fuel card provider, and ChargePoint. And many of you already know all of this information, but I'll tell it to you anyway. The ChargePoint's got locations all across the state. When we issue a vehicle, we issue a driver a fuel card where they can fill up with gasoline at a convenience store, but there are no convenience stores really for EVs, except ChargePoint has locations across the state where our drivers now can use the ChargePoint WEX fuel card just like a credit card at a gas station and fill up wherever they go. So ChargePoint works great for us in this case, for drivers who are traveling, but the real need for the state of North Carolina is infrastructure implemented and put into place at state-owned facilities where our vehicles park. Because that's where vehicles are overnight. That is where the biggest opportunity for growth of getting EVs into our fleet it will come from. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about education outreach. Motor fleet management. We have information on our webpage. We constantly have communication with our fleet coordinators at the agencies when it comes to vehicle replacement. And there's a few other points on here where we have educational opportunities. Motor Fleet is part of the DOA team, and the DOA team overall, there are different parts of the team that own different parts of this process. So if Mark would like to chime in, or if he's not available to chime in, that's okay. But this is a coordinated approach of education through all parts of DOA, which would be purchasing, for new contracts for EVs. It would be parking, state parking division. These are all divisions of the Department of Administration. There's the parking division, there's a state purchasing and contracting division, there's the facility management division, which manages facilities, and there's also the state construction office, which all of them share responsibilities for. If you're going to put infrastructure on your site, you're going to involve the state construction office. If you're going to acquire EVs, or if you're going to get hybrid vehicles on state contract, you've got to go through purchasing and contracting, and those things are being done. State parking manages all the parking facilities downtown. If infrastructure is going to go into place, state parking is going to be a key participant in that. And so I'm from Motor Fleet, but there's a team at DOA that's working on this as well along with me. So some of this education comes from all those various divisions of the Department of Administration, not just Motor Fleet Management. Slide, please.
1 minute, Mark. Rob.
Yeah. Oh, 1 minute. Oh, perfect. I thought you were actually cutting in on me there, Jeremy. No, I've got 1 minute left. Hey, we're at the last slide. That's perfect timing then. The next step for us are going to be to communicate the results of SawWatch lab analysis that we're going to get back here very soon. We're going to, try to help agencies find vehicles that are good solutions for the work they're doing. And we're going to continue to push for infrastructure in place. And hey, we're going to manage whatever other obstacles come at COVID and any other obstacles that come at us. We're going to manage those so we can add more EVs to our fleet at every opportunity that's presented. So Jeremy, I'm done. That was all.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the update. Before we move to our next topic, I just wanted to flag for the Climate Council. Rob is a great resource. Please stay in touch with your motor fleet specialists in your agency and help encourage them to continue looking at zero emission vehicles when the cycle comes around and it's time to think about transitioning, replacing vehicles. So hearing that message, I think, from the council members is always welcome and has been extremely helpful. Let's move on to the next topic. So in Executive Order 80, one of the directives was for this council, led by North Carolina Department of Transportation, to develop a zero emission vehicle plan, which we successfully did. And I'm going to turn over to Heather Hildebrandt, who is our statewide initiatives supervisor in the Transportation Planning Division at DOT, and she'll give us an update on implementation of that ZEV plan. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Jeremy. Matt, first slide. You can go to the next one. Thanks. Okay, so basically one of the things I wanted to highlight, obviously with our goal with vehicle registrations for ZEVs, which is including both battery electric vehicles, which are fully electric vehicles, as well as plug-in hybrids. I wanted to show you where we were at. So as of the end of last month, which is when we update the data for registrations, we're about halfway there. We got about 25,000 vehicles that are registered that meet those qualifications. It's slowly creeping up. The registrations obviously need to uptick a little bit more for us to meet our targeted goal by the deadline. Next slide, Matt. In the ZEV plan, we had 4 action areas: education, convenience, affordability, and policy. Highlighted in blue on this chart are the initiatives that we have made some progress towards. A lot of the education efforts were kind of derailed by COVID, as I'm sure you all are aware. Ride and drive events that we had scheduled for, to coincide with Earth Day in April were derailed, and pretty much that has all been put on hold. We have continued to work with DMV about developing information to be shared at the offices, but of course, with people not going to DMV, that educational outreach avenue has also been limited. We have, one of the first things that we did want to do was post vehicle registration data on our website. That has been accomplished. That's where you saw the information from the chart came from, that registration data. Areas can actually sort that data by county. So if you're curious only in your county and how those numbers are changing, you can actually download county-specific data for registration. So that's one of our major wins in the last year. Looking at vehicle charging infrastructure, we've obviously made some progress on that as well. Trying to partner with the Division of Air Quality in the Volkswagen settlement funds to try to help promote, just kind of expanding our infrastructure. And with respect to signage, we also are participating in many multi-state groups as well on how we can do signage. Next slide, Matt. Also, one of the things that we had wanted to focus on within North Carolina is expanding and identifying those EV corridors. What you see here is actually both the corridors that have been designated as alternative fuel corridors by FHWA, as well as what we plan to, or we have actually submitted to FHWA for the 5th and final round for alternative fuel corridors. And so, as you can see, this positions North Carolina very well to have the bulk of the highly trafficked areas designated as corridors. We still have a lot of work to be done on these corridors, as the darker lines that you see here are either in yellow or in yellow, whether they be thicker or lighter, are areas where it's signage pending, which basically means that we do have stations that are along this route. It is a route that is that we have identified as of being of importance to connecting people and goods across the state, but we don't have sufficient infrastructure to actually designate that corridor, which basically means that you have to have at least no more than 50 miles between stations and they have to be DC fast. Next slide. Kind of expanding a little bit on the EVSE signage issue. North Carolina DOT does have a process in place for either food establishments or lodging establishments to add a supplemental messaging on their sign. So as you see in this picture right here, which is in Cary, we have a McDonald's that has EV charging and they're announcing that on their logo sign. However, we've been in conversations with other states as to expanding the options for signage, whether that be, corridor signing, identifying that you're on a corridor that has sufficient EV charging, or whether that be wayfinding signage. So we are continuing to work on that effort moving forward. Next slide, please. Also within the ZEB plan, and something that is also under NCDOT's kind of area of expertise and our relationships with the transit systems within North Carolina, is we have been working with the transit systems to talk about electrification of transit. We have had webinars for the systems to share not only the current deployment of electrified transit buses within North Carolina, but also to provide options for smaller systems. There are readily available large transit buses, but within North Carolina, we have over 100 transit systems. Most of them, or many of them, are using less than buses. So things like, raised roof vans, whether it be, or very, very small buses where there's not a readily available electric option. So we are working with them about technology options and just trying to get them thinking about electrification. Obviously, with the Volkswagen settlement, which I mentioned before, that is a source of funding. There have been buses that have been funded through the Volkswagen. And then there's also CMAQ funding, which NCDOT also administers in 24 eligible counties. And so we have funded transit bus electrification through CMAQ, and we will continue to do so moving forward. Next slide. I also touched very briefly on some of the multi-state initiatives. So, North Carolina is not in a vacuum. It's very important, especially on the DOT side, that we look into electrification and partnerships in our neighboring states, because obviously we don't want to, install infrastructure without understanding how it connects to other states. So, one of the things that I think my guy Brzezinski will be talking about later today is the medium and heavy duty MOU, which is looking at how we can electrify medium and heavy duty vehicles, with the hope again that we will receive some additional options, not only for the general public, but also for some of those transit applications where we see kind of some gaps within the vehicle technologies available currently. We also partnered with Tennessee and Arkansas to develop the I-40 alternative fuel corridor deployment plan. Obviously, I-40 bisecting the state east to west is very important for us to look at, not only with electric infrastructure, but also with other alternative fuels such as compressed natural gas and liquid propane. We also are involved in the Southeast EV Corridor Council. This is where we've been really focusing in on that corridor signage issue and also coordination of putting in infrastructure to make sure that we are placing infrastructure on our side of our state lines, so that it kind of continues those corridors, I-95, I-85, I-40 within our sister states. Next slide, Matt. And this is just my contact information. Again, as Jeremy indicated, I'm the statewide initiative supervisor. That is the group within North Carolina that kind of looks at these, broader, statewide programs, of which alternative fuels and electrification is one of our major goals. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you all. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Heather, for that overview. I'd encourage folks, if you have questions about the ZEV plan or any of the particular topics Heather mentioned, please do go ahead out and reach out to her directly. Moving to the next item, we're going to cover the medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle memorandum of understanding. Governor Cooper joined a number of states this summer in signing that memorandum of understanding. Mike Abrazinskis, the director of the Division of Air Quality at the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, is going to give us an update and status report out on where things stand with that MOU. And I will say Mike and Heather are North Carolina's representatives to the Zero Emission Vehicle Task Force. So Mike, appreciate you representing the state on that body. Thanks.
All right, great, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Next slide, please, Matthew. Okay, so today I'm going to focus on a sector of vehicles, that's the medium and heavy duty sector, where there's great opportunity for further stimulating the adoption of zero emission vehicles or ZEVs. I'll summarize a few of the clean transportation initiatives that the executive branch is already involved in, has some crossover into the medium and heavy duty sector. You all are familiar with Executive Order 80. It's a very important piece to the puzzle, working to advance our clean transportation options for the purposes of lowering GHG emissions and advancing toward a clean energy economy. And so there are ZEV goals and plans developed as part of that initiative, and you've heard about some of that during the prior presentations. But this morning, I'm going to focus on 3 programs the Division of Air Quality is involved in that are helping advance and further stimulate the adoption of the ZEVs. Those include the Diesel Emission Reduction Act, or DERA, the Volkswagen or VW settlement, and an additional initiative that's called the Medium and Heavy Duty ZEV Memorandum of Understanding. Next slide, please. So one quick slide on DERA. This is a federal funding program administered by the Division of Air Quality. Our division has years of experience in providing support through various initiatives that are accelerating the adoption of cleaner vehicles, including electric vehicles in the medium and heavy duty sector. So through the DERA program, we've awarded projects like the ones you see here on this slide. And these are just a few examples. It's showing that the technology is there. There's interest in shifting to cleaner transportation options in the medium and heavy duty sector. So there's an opportunity here. There's one point I'll call your attention to on this slide, and that's the capital costs of the electric vehicles that were awarded under this program. These are electric refuse trucks and an electric transit bus, as shown here on the slide. And I'll note that the City of Charlotte electric transit bus project cost does not include infrastructure costs, but that project was awarded to cover a portion of the cost of the bus. Next slide, please. So like the DERA efforts, our division is administering the Volkswagen settlement funds. And so phase 1 of that work awarded investments in the electric school bus category and electric transit bus category, as shown here on the slide. And consistent with EO80, these projects are providing key proof of concepts that the electrification of the medium and heavy duty sector is viable. And with manufacturers of electric school buses being in North Carolina, it represents an opportunity for further stimulating a clean energy economy in our state. Next slide, please. So when we're using this term medium and heavy duty vehicles, it's important to make sure we define what that is and the types of vehicles that includes. So I'll draw your attention to the bottom right-hand portion where there are pictures simply showing that the medium and heavy duty sector includes everything from a step van up to a concrete truck or a sleeper berth for a tractor trailer and everything in between. Next slide, please. All right, so I've shared with you some of the recent examples through DERA and Volkswagen, but there's more that can be done in this sector, and that's where this medium and heavy-duty ZEV memorandum of understanding comes into play. It's an electric transportation policy with aspirational goals included that Carolina has signed on to with 14 other states. Its focus is to advance and accelerate the market for electric medium and heavy duty vehicles, and to achieve at least 30% of all medium and heavy duty vehicle sales in 2030 be electric vehicles, and all new medium and heavy duty sales be zero emission vehicles by 2050. So if this is achieved, it'll have the impact of significantly reducing GHG emissions from this source sector, and it will also provide public health benefits by reducing air pollution overall. And this is especially important in disadvantaged communities that have been burdened with higher levels of air pollution and heavy truck traffic. Next slide, please. So the states that have signed on to this MOU are shown here in green on the map. And I'll also note that together the participating states are sharing information through a task force that are working to address a lot of the common elements of implementing programs like this and make progress toward these medium and heavy duty ZEV goals. Our Division of Air Quality staff are actively engaged and in participating in the task force, as are DOT staff. Next slide, please. So together, the MOU states task force is working on an action plan framework that will help identify opportunities, identify barriers, propose solutions to support widespread electrification of the medium and heavy duty sector. And so a key element of that action plan is to focus on disadvantaged communities. And the core principles there include sharing equitably in the benefits of truck and bus electrification, providing meaningful opportunities for input, meeting community needs, and building long-term relationships. We're very early in this process in North Carolina. And so while there's a lot of considerations listed on the right-hand portion of this slide, we're only beginning our efforts and getting organized here in North Carolina. And so this list includes things identified thus far by the task force. I would say a menu of options, if you will, and additional coordination and discussion will occur between executive agencies, including, but not limited to, DOT and Commerce and DOA, and of course DEQ and the governor's office. Next slide, please. So as we're getting organized, we're learning by interacting with members of the state task force on these bi-monthly calls. And at a national and regional level, we're hearing from equipment manufacturers about the technology, from commercial fleet owners, but most notably, I would say a strong stakeholder engagement process in North Carolina's efforts is going to be a central part of our program. Next slide, please. A few quick snapshots of examples of industries adopting electric medium and heavy duty vehicles. You're starting to see some of these on the road. So just again, a snapshot of some of these that you might be seeing more of, and just to note that we have a great potential in North Carolina for partnerships. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've noted that the technology is here. There's interest in shifting toward cleaner transportation options in this medium and heavy duty sector. And so there's opportunity. And so as we begin this work in North Carolina, some early brainstorming has led to the identification of potential barriers that we must work on together. And we recognize that, you know, accelerating medium and heavy duty ZEV adoption must involve some level of incentives as the capital costs of these types of vehicles are relatively high. The infrastructure is not cheap. So discussions with utilities are critical as well about providing the requisite power supplies. Do we have the right skilled workforce to service and maintain fleets of electric vehicles? these are all questions and things we need to continue to address and work on together. So when we begin talking about a vision of moving this forward, I think some of the key principles include just great two-way communications, information sharing, providing opportunities for formal and informal input, strong stakeholder engagement in developing the details of an action. And that includes building relationships and fostering participation with EJ and community groups on clean transportation initiatives. Next slide, please.
Hey, Mike, just want to jump in and give you a 30-second warning.
10-4, last slide. So with all of those principles and the vision in mind, we at DEQ have conducted an initial consultation with our DEQ, EJ, and Equity Advisory Board just this past Monday, where we presented to the board this set of questions that are going to help facilitate thought and input and feedback on this initiative. And so we look forward to continuing our dialogue with the advisory board. All right, next slide. So that's the end of my update this morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My contact information is provided here, but more importantly, Robin Barrows, our Allied Program Supervisor and lead point of contact on this medium and heavy duty ZEV MOU within DAQ, her contact information is provided as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Mike. So Sushma, we'll turn it back over to you, but hope folks learned some things over the past hour about a number of the initiatives we're doing or considering doing when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector in North Carolina. That sector, at last count, it adds up to about 32% of our total greenhouse gas footprint. So really appreciate the work that all the presenters are doing to tackle that sector. And equally important, those of you who are attendees and stakeholders who are working on transportation sector policy, really value our engagement with you and look forward to continuing to work together on these programs and new initiatives.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thank you to all the presenters and the people who helped them. So we're going to shift now to two parts of the Clean Energy Plan. In the last year, we have been working with the stakeholder bodies to implement two key recommendations. So I encourage you all to just sit back. We're going to go through some serious technical details, but we'll try to keep it as high level as possible. However, due to the importance and the complexity of the subject, we do feel like there are some things that we need to dive in. So I will start out with a presentation overview of the Clean Energy Plan Recommendation B1. This was titled as a North Carolina Energy Regulatory Process, and I'll pass it to my colleague Jessica Shipley at the Regulatory Assistance Project, and she will get into some of the nuts and bolts of our recommendations and the actions that we came up with. Next, Matthew. This is just to remind everyone, in October 2019, as part of the first output from Executive Order 80, DEQ was directed to develop the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan. This particular report and the supporting documents that were released lay out a vision and a series of goals for our state to strive towards for the electric power sector. The three goals that have been defining the work that has culminated in the last year and plus has evolved around our goals affecting our people, our economy, and our environment. The first goal deals with environment and emission reductions of greenhouse gases. We set a goal of reducing GHG emissions by 70% by year 2030, using the 2005 as the baseline, and attaining carbon neutrality by 2050. That decarbonization path for the electric power sector will require us to address goal number 2, which is ensuring that affordability, price competitiveness, and price stability for our consumers is maintained while we modernize our power sector and regulatory and planning processes. And the third goal is related to Governor Cooper's executive order, which is economic development and ensuring that all of these transformations are occurring through job creations as a result of technology innovation and development and deployment that go hand in hand with that transformation. Next, please. So out of those goals, a key recommendation was that recognition that to successfully transition our energy sector to a 21st century model, we do need a regulatory model that incentivizes business decisions that benefit not only the utilities, but also the public at hand. And that the system we end up with, in addition to being safe and reliable and affordable, must be clean and equitable, as well as resilient and modern. So we came up with a few core values, which the stakeholders in the Clean Energy Plan said we needed to maintain and prioritize in whatever policy options that we pursued. One of that is significant and timely decline in greenhouse gas emissions, as I mentioned, ensuring affordable electricity rates, assuring that the services and the reliability of the power sector is maintained through our historical records, expanding clean energy resources such that deployment results in in-state economic development and job growth. And most of all, assuring that the equity and environmental justice considerations related to both access and the impacts from the transitioning from fossil to clean energy is accounted for the most overburdened communities that are often part of the equation. Next, please. So in the Clean Energy Plan, there were a variety of recommendations. You may recall that there were 6 categories, and within those 6 categories, there were buckets of specific recommendations. Recommendation B1 looked at the category utility incentives and comprehensive system planning. And that recommendation was really around designing policies that align our regulatory incentives that the utilities operate under and the processes with which public policy goals are set, ensuring that customer expectations are met and the utility needs are satisfied, all while technology evolution and innovation are occurring, and that we anticipate new technologies and new clean energy resources and other types of solutions to be offered to the power grid in the coming years. So our department, as part of the B1 recommendation, launched a stakeholder process in February 2020. Next, please. And that process was called the North Carolina Energy Regulatory Process. And the goal from the offset in February was to produce recommendations that policy and regulatory changes can be delivered to decision makers, particularly the North Carolina General Assembly, the North Carolina Utilities Commission, and North Carolina Governor as entities deemed appropriate. We do realize that there are actions and responsibilities that certain decision makers can take uniquely or collectively through their own authorities. We also recognize that the purpose of NERP had to be that that the results must take the form of issues, briefs, and policy proposals that can be directly implemented. So we set out an objective to build expertise and trust among a group of hand-selected stakeholders. We built this through shared principles, through foundation setting, through education from invited national experts, and identifying what our priority action areas should be. We examined alternatives to the traditional utility regulatory model and incentives. We examined other parallel efforts where carbon reduction policies were being evaluated. And as needed, we also looked at energy market reforms that the stakeholder group felt deemed appropriate. And at the end, our objective was to produce specific policy proposals that we all can work to implement. And we brought in, again, the Regulatory Assistance Project, one of which Jessica will talk later in this presentation, and Rocky Mountain Institute to facilitate the dialogue with these stakeholders. Next slide, please. The 40 or so stakeholders consist of state government officials, a few from the North Carolina General Assembly, our state agencies, our Utilities Commission, and our Commission Public Staff. It also included all of the regulated utilities and representatives from the municipal utilities, as well as the cooperatives, local government representatives, consumer advocates and customer representatives, industry representatives, clean energy and environmental non-governmental organizations. We also had representatives from the environmental justice and equity constituents and the academia. Next, please. So right now, our website and press release shows that in December 2022, we released the NERP, North Carolina Energy Regulatory Process output. It consists of one summary report developed by our facilitators and 4 distinct work products that came out of the North Carolina stakeholders. This process, as I said, was launched in February 22, and it has led to these policy proposals on energy reform. I wanted to just shout out to all of the people that put in hundreds, if not thousands of hours over almost a year to come up with these solutions and these path forwards for North Carolina. I do also want to say that even though it was, we worked collectively, the report does not necessarily represent a consensus viewpoint or unanimously held positions of all the participants. However, the participants did work in good faith to identify broadly supported and meaningful reforms that balance their particular interests and state policy goals. If later on, as Jessica talks about it, feel free to contact any of these people who led the study groups. So Jess, please continue on. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. As Sushma said, I'm Jessica Shipley with Regulatory Assistance Project. We were one of the technical advisors and facilitators for the NERP process. The rest of my presentation is going to walk through a bit of our process for conducting NERP, and then I'm going to go into some of the detail on the substance of what NERP worked on and the conclusions and recommendations. So first, starting with the process. The first 2 phases involved setting foundations for the work ahead and doing what we called topical deep dives. As a general rule, we tried to follow a structure that involved introducing a new topic or theory, bringing in outside experts, using case studies from other states, assessing the context in North Carolina and how these topics would play out there. We also supplemented with other things like webinars. And then a key aspect of NERP were study groups, which you'll hear me mention quite a number of times. These were voluntary groups of participants that came together for research and analysis. The first group was formed roughly around workshop 3, but there were others that were formed throughout the rest of the process. Next slide. The third phase is where we transitioned into policy development. Again, the study groups really drove the bulk of the work during this phase. And on the next slide, you can see the study group output process being added in here. They started coming into workshops through the end of phase 2 and phase 3 with policy proposals and ideas. Several groups had opportunities to do multiple iterations and revisions to their proposals, bringing them back to the larger group for feedback. Next slide, please. One of the first things that we did in NERP was define the priority outcomes that were most important to the participants. These were an outgrowth of the values that were prioritized in the Clean Energy Plan. We grouped them into 4 categories, and then you can see the list of outcomes there on the right. So despite the Clean Energy Plan and all the stakeholders that contribute to it, it was important in this process to spend some time discussing the problem that we were trying to solve. Because of the diversity in our participant group, we felt that we needed to reassess what was most important to accomplish with our particular effort in 2020. Next slide. And we also asked participants to prioritize among the many outcomes that they had noted. Those are the 3 that they prioritized are shown in the blue boxes here. This was just to help narrow down the scope of the work that would then follow. Next slide. So I've mentioned study groups a couple of times already, and this is where I'll go into some more detail on what those groups did. We asked the participants to decide which policy options warranted further development and exploration. And so they formed study groups around these topics. Again, these were voluntary sub-teams of participants that stepped up to research, investigate, debate, and develop these topics into more fully fledged policy options for the state to consider. And as facilitators, RAP and RMI provided support to these groups, but they were entirely participant driven. And they focused on these 4 topical areas. As Sushma noted, not all NERP participants agreed on the final conclusions within these topics, but we did have dedicated participation from a wide variety of stakeholders in all of the study groups. And just on a personal note, I also want to thank everyone who contributed to the work of these groups. It was truly Herculean and impressive. For the bulk of the rest of my presentation, I will briefly explain each of these 4 areas, the high-level conclusions reached by NERP, and also give you a couple of quick examples of how these topics have been addressed elsewhere around the country. Next slide. Yeah. So with PBR, which is performance-based regulation, the first topic here, the primary purpose is to better align regulatory and utility incentives with societally desired outcomes. So this group focused on the NERP outcomes I mentioned a couple of slides ago. And PBR allows you to create specific incentives for desired outcomes and also to remove some of the perverse incentives that exist in the traditional regulatory structure. The Wholesale Market Reform Group looked at various options for reforming wholesale electricity markets in North Carolina, with some goals of this group were to promote increased competition, reduce costs, and also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Asset retirement, a focus for many of our stakeholders and also a topic of conversation elsewhere in the state. Coal plant retirement was a key topic analyzed also in the A1 research that you'll hear about in a minute. The NERP process focused on the ways to speed up asset retirement and deal with the financial and regulatory implications of doing that. There are various options with different impacts on customers and utilities, and securitization is one of those options. It's generally believed to provide a mechanism to retire coal units early while saving customers money and providing a source of funding for investing in impacted communities. And securitization was the focus for the NERP study group that looked at asset retirement. So you'll hear me refer to securitization a number of times because that was really their focus. And last but not least, competitive procurement. This is about opening up utility procurement processes to bids from non-utility actors. So rather than allowing a utility to simply procure all the resources that it needs, you would issue a competitive RFP with various parameters and see what the private market would generate. By creating sort of a level playing field for resources to compete, you can ensure that new resources are the least cost option for meeting whatever that specified need is. So I'm going to go through each of these study groups and tell you what the NERP final conclusions were, as well as I mentioned, give you a couple of examples from elsewhere around the country. So first with PBR, which is the next slide. Sorry, Matthew, you could click a couple of times. Yeah, that's good. The NERP group's high-level findings were that the General Assembly should direct the Utilities Commission to undertake PBR. The group also thought that there were likely some aspects of PBR that the Commission can do already with existing statutory authority, and that the PBR framework for North Carolina should include 3 parts, kind of a comprehensive package. 1, revenue decoupling, which breaks the link between the amount of revenue that a utility makes and the amount of energy that it sells to its customers, which removes the utility's disincentive to invest in things that decrease sales, like energy efficiency or customer-cited resources. Also, performance incentive mechanisms, which can be used to target utility performance in critical areas, and the group focused on a number of areas in which they thought a PIM or a performance incentive mechanism might be appropriate. including renewable energy, energy efficiency, affordability, carbon emissions. You can see there's a list there. And then finally, that this should all be implemented through a multi-year rate plan, which would mean that the utility would not come in for a rate case for a set period of time, which gives an incentive for the utility to control costs. And the multi-year rate plan would also help protect customers by including an earnings sharing mechanism to make sure any excess earnings the utility would see would be shared to some extent with customers. Next slide. So this map shows almost half the states are now looking at PBR or some other aspect of utility business model reform. Of course, it's important to note that these states are not all doing the same kinds of things and they haven't all made the same amount of progress, but it is useful to see that that work is happening and growing. And there were two states that NERP looked at in some more detail, Minnesota and Hawaii. And Minnesota has taken more of a stepwise approach. They first implemented decoupling many years ago, followed by multi-year rate plans for Xcel Energy, their large investor-owned utility. And then recently, the commission adopted performance metrics for following an extensive stakeholder process. And Xcel is now working on the methodologies for calculating those. Hawaii is really implementing what we would call comprehensive PBR. They have had decoupling and multi-year rate plans for several years, but the commission recently adopted updates to the multi-year rate plan to provide stronger cost-saving incentives and protections for customers, as well as new performance incentives for certain key areas the commission felt deserved more targeted attention from the utilities. Next slide. Second study group, the wholesale market study group. The group primarily focused on a recommendation for a study to be conducted to determine the potential costs and benefits of forming a Carolinas RTO. They also discussed other potential options for North Carolina to be a part of a wholesale market. They ultimately concluded that joining the existing PJM market may not be the best path forward for meeting North Carolina's goals. And ultimately, the group concluded that a market study would require the General Assembly direction. And so that is sort of the ultimate recommendation of that group. And they provided some legislative language on that. Next slide, please. Wholesale markets elsewhere. These are areas of the country where generation resources are part of an organized market, competing with one another according to various market rules and selling generation to distribution utilities who then deliver power to end-use customers, which is a generalization of how wholesale markets work, but it's a general summary. There have been many studies into wholesale markets and their impacts, and we now have a lot of experiential data as well that points to potential benefits, including reduced costs and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Also worth noting, I think that South Carolina's legislature passed a market study bill last year, and that work is happening this calendar year. Next slide, please. Sorry, click a few times for me on this one, Matt. On asset retirement, the group concluded that uneconomic coal assets are likely operating in North Carolina, that incentives are not aligned to encourage those assets to be retired as quickly as possible, and that, as I mentioned, securitization is just one tool for addressing this issue, but it has potential upsides that other asset retirement tools maybe do not. Click one more time for me, Matthew. And that legislative action would be needed in order to expand the available uses of securitization to include asset retirement. North Carolina already has securitization available for one particular use, but not for asset retirement. So the group made some recommendations around legislative action. Next slide. Securitization as a tool has been used for many years by many states for various purposes, primarily for dealing with stranded costs. Recently, more states have looked at using it for the purpose of early plant retirement. And the map on the upper left shows where securitization has been active. And the check marks, they're kind of small, but the check marks show the states where it is currently active as a tool. Colorado, Michigan, New Mexico, and Montana have passed laws enabling it for early plant retirement. Some examples of how it's been used in the lower right. Duke Energy Florida securitized $1.3 billion of the remaining plant balance of the Crystal River nuclear plant, resulting in $700 million in customer savings. Consumers Energy in Michigan in 2014 used a $390 million bond issue to recover costs on a coal unit, which yielded the utilities customers $135 million in savings. And then an example not on the slide, PNM Resources in New Mexico is in the process currently of securitizing its San Juan coal plant and replacing it with a portfolio of renewables and storage. Next slide, please. This table is from one of the NERP study group outputs. It's the study group did an analysis of the laws that have passed enabling securitization for asset retirement and compared it to the existing storm cost recovery authorization in North Carolina. So just a flavor of some of the work that the NERP study groups did, and that's available, as Sushma mentioned, on the website. Next slide, please. Last but certainly not least, again, competitive procurement. Competitive solicitations, these are the kind of the high level conclusions of the NERP group, that competitive solicitation should be used to meet identified energy and capacity needs. And you may be aware competitive solicitation already exists in North Carolina under Senate Bill 589 for a limited volume of renewable energy to be competitively bid. The recommendations of NERP would create broader application of this tool. It would mean that when the utilities retire existing generation assets, they could be replaced competitively based on what the market would provide, which could lead to other things being potentially brought online, like storage, renewable energy, potentially demand-side resources. And this is certainly something we're seeing in competitive solicitation in other parts of the country, which I'll share in a minute. The group concluded that the General Assembly or the Utilities Commission could expand the use of competitive solicitation, but that it has many design considerations that the Commission would ultimately need to determine, including the scope, sort of what resources are allowed to compete, and then whether and how utilities can participate in that solicitation. Next slide. So this map shows the types of procurement in place in various parts of the country. I'm going to walk through it here because the text is a little small. The bright blue places are where procurement is driven primarily by market competition in the state. So for the purposes of this discussion, we can ignore the bright blue states. The states in dark blue, royal blue, and bright green have some form of competitive solicitation for all new resources. So that means that when a utility wants to build a new generation resource, they must put that out for bid from other entities. Some states, like I mentioned, like North Carolina, have no formal requirement for competitive solicitation, but do have a requirement for a limited competitive procurement of renewable energy. Next slide, please. And NERP did a deep dive on the Colorado process because this is one of the states that uses what's called all-source competitive procurement, which just means that any resource that meets the specifications in the RFP can bid. This is done as part of the planning process in Colorado. It's open to bids from resources from a variety of types as long as they meet the certain minimum criteria. And the results from their most recent procurement included market-leading prices for renewables and storage. They were the lowest prices anyone had seen to date. The winning bids, not surprisingly, were primarily from renewables and storage, with 380 megawatts of existing gas also being selected. And ultimately, it will save customers $200 million compared to the original portfolio that was proposed by the company. So these are the benefits that really interested the NERP participants, and that's why they included this in their final products. Next slide. So my last couple of slides just provide some summary points. This table is not a NERP product. It is a summary table that I created. It shows all of the outcomes that NERP prioritized along the left, and then all of the policy options that they looked at across the top. And just based on the findings of the NERP participants, I added check marks to indicate the policies that seem best equipped to address the various outcomes. This is just meant to give a flavor for the fact that many of the policies that NERP studied do directly address the outcomes that they were seeking to address. And next slide, Sushma already shared with you some of the images of the final products of NERP. I wanted to also include this longer list because it gives a full picture of the work that went into the NERP process. Each of the 4 large boxes represents one of the study groups, and they each created several final products, including draft legislative language, case studies, fact sheets, etc. And then the facilitators of the process wrote a final summary report as well. And on the last slide, I would just want to encourage you to check out all the outputs from NERP on the website and contact any of the study group chairs or myself or Sushma to learn more. And I'll hand it back to you, Sushma, for some final words.
Thanks, Jessica. Next slide, Matthew. Last slide. So I wanted to give everyone a flavor of where we're headed next. As you know, that these are policy proposals, and many of the NERP participants are now actively engaged with various bodies on how to move some of these items forward, along with their own other priorities. The North Carolina General Assembly has started a stakeholder process, and that will continue throughout this spring time period. We are expecting some energy bills coming out of that effort, and our team is available to provide technical and other types of advice and support as needed to support those stakeholders. Additionally, we are working on a very tight deliverable and timeline, a roadmap of what we call roadmap of energy policy options for Governor Cooper. Again, this is about synthesizing the results of the A1 and B1 reports. The A1 reports you'll hear in a few minutes. But there's a lot that you heard today. At the end of the day, there are things that are within the purview of the governor and also other authoritative bodies. And so our goal is to identify a menu of options that can be taken through executive action, and also identify complementary and standalone utility regulatory actions that the commission can take and legislative authorities can take through their own lawmaking options. We're targeting this report to be delivered in mid-April or so. And so I just want to let everyone know that that is work that we're doing, DEQ is doing with RAP and RMI to synthesize the results of the 2 reports. Thank you. And we're only 3 minutes over, but we'll pass on to Jeremy to move on to the A1.
So next, we're going to turn to a presentation by Kate Konchnick, who is the Director of Climate and Energy at Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Climate Policy Solutions. Kate's going to provide a summary of, somehow in the short time that she has, she's going to provide a summary of the more than a year-long stakeholder process that her team from Duke University and UNC Law School facilitated through 2020. And this is per recommendation, the first recommendation of the Clean Energy Plan, recommendation A1. So this process and the report that Kate will talk about are going to provide valuable information to help all of us in North Carolina understand the types of policies that could help North Carolina achieve the Clean Energy Plan goal of 70% reduction in power sector greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. The final report on that process and analysis is going to be delivered to Governor Cooper soon, and will be released for the public as well. We'd welcome any stakeholder input on the policies and policy designs that are analyzed and discussed in the report. We welcome your input on which policies you think make sense for North Carolina. With that, Kate, I think we can hear you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And thank you all for inviting me here today to talk about recommendation A1 from the Clean Energy Plan. Researchers at UNC and Duke University, along a broad range of stakeholders, have been really hard at work for more than a year to study options for hitting the CEP's power sector emissions targets. I want to especially acknowledge contributions of the state agency representatives who worked with us, particularly Sushma and her team at TEQ, and staff at the Utilities Commission and public staff. It's been a pleasure working with you and learning from you during this process. My goal over the next 15 minutes or so, as Jeremy said, it's a tall order, but I'm going to try to provide some background on the A1 recommendation and share some of our findings with you. Two caveats worth stating at the outset. First, the report will not make recommendations. We didn't seek to tell the state what to do, but to inform the options that North Carolina has to cut pollution from the power sector and grow a clean energy economy that works for the whole state. Second, numbers in the report should be used for directional purposes only. Sadly, our models don't serve as crystal balls, and the further we go out in time, the more uncertain results will be. But by understanding the trajectories that different policies start us on, the state can make more informed decisions. Next slide. So as you know, the EO80 set economy-wide carbon pollution reduction targets and directed DEQ to run a stakeholder process that culminated in the CEP. The plan then established additional goals for cutting carbon pollution from our power sector. And I just want to make 3 quick points on this slide and these targets. One, these represent deeper reductions than the economy-wide targets set by Governor Cooper in EO80. That's because there are readily available technologies in this sector, more than other sectors, to begin decarbonizing today. In addition, EO80, of course, contemplated the electrification of other sectors, including transportation, which we've discussed already today. Cleaning up the grid enables electrification without additional emissions. Second point, these emissions goals don't just relate to in-state generation, but to the emissions associated with any electricity imported to North Carolina for our use. This can require some tricky accounting compared to just reading the monitors and smokestacks on our own power plants. Including emissions associated with imports is also a bit more challenging because obviously state policy can only indirectly affect how generators in other states choose to make electricity. And my third point on this slide is just, I do want to emphasize that term carbon neutrality in that 2050 goal. This doesn't necessarily mean that the power sector will emit nothing mid-century, but that anything it does emit must be offset somewhere else in the economy. For this reason, when we modeled different types of policies, we told the models to solve for a 95% reduction from those 2005 levels. This helped with grid reliability, among other things. And then we did not dig into how to meet those last 5% of emissions, but assume it would probably be some sort of offsets. Next slide. So the CEP laid out about 36 recommendations. We've been hearing about others today, but the first one, recommendation A1, is the focus of my talk. That recommendation called on universities and stakeholders to deliver a report that studied the effect of different types of climate and clean energy policies on the power consumed in North Carolina. This text says the report will recommend, but again, we decided it'd be more useful to provide a report that served more as an options document, laying out the different ways that North Carolina could achieve these goals. In part, this is because, as we ultimately found in our analysis, there isn't just one path forward. This is the good news of our report. We have options. We compare those options along a number of metrics to seed a conversation about trade-offs and values. But we can do this. The question now is just, how do we want to do this? We started our process building on the list of potential policy pathways identified in the CEP and listed here so that we wouldn't lose the great thinking that went into that year-long process. Our goal was to dig into each pathway, come up with specific policy designs, and then analyze them for comparative purposes. Next slide. We also started with the list of CEP stakeholders to identify folks willing to engage in a deeper dive on power sector policies and willing to dedicate another year of their lives on EO80 work. We supplemented that list with constituencies and geographies across the state that appeared underrepresented in the CEP process. This became our stakeholder group for A1. We convened bi-monthly through last fall to provide updates on our report and solicit input. Unfortunately, we were only able to meet twice in person before COVID took our meetings online. From that group, we also created 2 smaller working groups, one focused on policy and the other on technical modeling. These groups worked in a much more intensive way on this project. We met monthly and sometimes more, all together or in subgroups tackling specific policy or technical questions. The groups fleshed out policy options looking to other states for inspiration, but then discussing what would work here in North Carolina. We analyzed these options with 2 power sector models. We then further subjected a subset of policies to rate, bill, and macroeconomic analysis. And we discussed ways to tweak the design of these modeled policies to achieve different outcomes. For instance, to make a policy more flexible to achieve, more cost-effective, or more protective of fence-line communities. We invited and received comments on the draft report from our working groups and the larger stakeholder group. As Jeremy said, we're incorporating those comments now and should have a final report out very soon. Throughout this process, we kept an eye on other discussions and analyses underway that might influence policy choices for North Carolina, including the B1 conversations we just heard about, utility climate goals, Duke Energy's clean energy modeling and IRP filings, and an incoming federal administration that has made climate a top policy priority. Next slide. This is just a brief sampling of the interests represented in our process. There are so many individuals to acknowledge it would take all of my time, so I won't do that. But I just wanted this group to understand the diversity of views we had in the room working on the A1 report, and to appreciate the hard work, engaged conversations, and open minds that we needed to contribute to the final product. We also learned outreach lessons along the way. For instance, in the summer, we were urged to hold 2 public forums and to create fact sheets in English and Spanish about our work to bring more North Carolinians along in the process. Next slide. Now for the meat of the report. Again, we started with the policy pathways identified in the CEP and then worked from there. Briefly, we looked at 4 types or groupings of policies. First, we asked, what would it look like to retire all the coal in North Carolina by 2030? Or to retire the smaller, less efficient coal units by that time and reduce utilization of the larger, more efficient plants? What would run in coal's place? And what would be built to replace those units? Next, we studied what would happen if we incorporated a shadow price into utility decisions about what to build and what to run. Duke and Dominion already build modest prices into their IRPs to hedge bets against future state or federal climate policy. We looked at different levels of these adders to see how they changed the relative costs of different generators and therefore our least cost analyses. Would modest adders be enough to shift new capacity from gas to solar or wind or batteries? We also studied the option of participating in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative Program, which Virginia joined earlier this year. Under this pathway, North Carolina would establish a ceiling for carbon pollution from the power sector and then tighten that budget over time. The program operates somewhat like a game of musical chairs. There are fewer emissions allowed each year, and generators need to hold enough allowances to cover their carbon pollution. If a generator shuts down or reduces its emissions, it can sell its allowances to another generator, but the total budget may not be exceeded. The program is similar to North Carolina's highly successful Clean Smokestacks program. And finally, we studied clean energy standards, which would build on the NC REPS program. Clean energy standards allow more resources to participate than a renewable portfolio standard. So they might include nuclear, fossil with carbon capture, and any other non-emitting resource. We looked at a number of CES design options, including one that required part of the standard to be met with offshore wind, and others that allowed energy efficiency to be used to meet part of the requirement. We ran variations on these policies. We also ran so-called sensitivities, where we would tweak variables to see how that changed the results. What if gas prices were suddenly higher? What if the federal government imposes a carbon tax? What if many people in North Carolina buy an electric vehicle and increase demand projections? Next slide. We could obviously spend a lot of time digging into the details of these policies, but at base, we were testing different push and pull mechanisms to see what would be most effective and most cost-effective at reducing pollution. For instance, some of the policies we studied put downward pressure on coal units. Others put downward pressure on anything that emits carbon dioxide, the carbon adders and the Reggie cap, for instance. One can compare the outcomes to see, is it better to target coal, the most carbon intensive resource currently online, or to discourage emissions generally and then let the market figure it out? And across these policies that seek to push out pollution, do they inherently encourage build out of clean energy, or rely more heavily on imports to make up the difference. Other policies, meanwhile, require construction of clean energy resources. These are sort of pulling new resources into the grid. Again, these clean energy standards can specify resources, for instance, saying you need to build offshore wind to meet this standard, or they can be technology neutral. One can compare these variations to see what zero emitting resources get built as a matter of pure economics, and what other benefits you achieve by pulling specific resources onto the grid, namely things like jobs or economic development. And then what happens if you combine a push and a pull policy? We also looked at those combinations to see how they changed results in cost, emissions, and grid makeup. Push policies are less efficient at bringing in clean generation. Pull policies are less efficient at reducing use of emitting generation. Combining them can bring advantages. Recall again that this report is best used for directional purposes rather than to rely on for absolute results. This is what we mean by that. The real takeaway is understanding these big dynamics to inform decisions about which of the levers to pull. Next slide. That said, there are a lot of numbers in this report, and if I'm warning against relying on the numbers as absolute values, why are they in there? We present numbers as a basis for comparison between policies. For any one of the categories on this list, certain policies may come out ahead. But of course, in the real world, we will feel the aggregate impact of all of these metrics. Different stakeholders will value some of these over others, but collectively, we need to find the best path forward for North Carolina. So we looked at emissions, both CO2 and more local pollutants for in-state generation. We looked at CO2 emissions associated with imported electricity. We looked at different types of costs. We also looked at the difference between capacity and generation. So capacity being what's installed in North Carolina. How many facilities do we have of different types and how big are they? Versus generation. How often do we call on each of those? How often are they available for us to call on? And then for a subset of policies, we looked at some more economic impacts. So rate and bill changes and jobs and gross state product. Next slide, please. By contrast, we also discussed two values that are highly important to North Carolinians and yet harder to quantify. So the whole previous slide were numbers that were readily available from our modeling. So they either were directly spit out as outputs or they were really easy calculations to derive from those outputs. These two values we spent a lot of time discussing because they're a little bit harder to quantify and yet very important. Our costs and emissions and jobs numbers start to get at affordability and equity, but they don't tell the full story. So the final report includes an entire section devoted to affordability and equity, reflecting stakeholder attempts to define or at least characterize these values. Then throughout the report, we propose design features that reflect these values that could be considered for any of the studied policies. Next slide. This is what I call my lawyer slide. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just wanted these caveats out there to remind listeners today and readers of our report. First of all, our results are not going to look like the modeling results in Duke Energy's IRPs. Lots of reasons for this, including that we modeled North Carolina's grid, not Duke's grid, and that we use different types of models and different modeling assumptions. The A1 report provides a detailed accounting of the assumptions we use so that everyone can see what we did. Duke Energy was a stakeholder in our process and provided valuable input, but we never attempted to duplicate their IRP filings or the way they operate the grid currently. We provide results of two models that select least cost resources to meet demand in North Carolina and the requirements of any particular policy. Another point to make on assumptions, we sometimes had disagreement about assumptions, particularly around renewables and battery storage, effectiveness of battery storage at meeting peak load, years over which we should pay back renewables. For our standard cases, we often took more conservative approaches to those renewables assumptions, but then we ran sensitivities to show you how much those assumptions can really change the outcomes. Next slide. So our big takeaways. The system is poised for transition. Recall back to that CEP target of 70% below 2005 levels by 2030. We focus a lot on this near-term target in our analysis while observing whether different options better prepare us for that tougher mid-century target. For context, when we started this process, the back of the envelope assumption was that business as usual would get us to about 50% reduction by 2030. Our models showed business as usual at 53%, one of them even 60%. This shows the uncertainty between models, but also that we are trending in the right direction. From our analysis of policies, as well as those sensitivities around gas and renewables prices, we found that small changes make a big difference. And that's because we're seeing a convergence of costs between resources. Coal is retiring across the US because it's become a relatively more expensive resource as gas prices and renewable costs go down. Policy here can make a difference. You might ask, why? If we're already headed in the right direction, why do we need policy? We find ourselves at a particular moment in time where momentum could be at the back of climate and clean energy policies. Coal is retiring, even just from the last 2 IRPs, Duke Energy has predicted more coal will retire more quickly. The question is, what replaces that coal? 10 years from now, if it's replaced predominantly with gas, that sets a very different course for us than if we diversify new capacity and lean into cleaner generation today. And finally, we have cost-effective options. The A1 report doesn't boil down to the one policy that does it all. There is not one clear winner, but this is a good thing. The state has multiple paths forward. Some of the modeled policies, accelerated coal retirements and joining RGGI, for instance, cost less than 1% more in system costs over business as usual from now to 2050. Again, these results are directional and come down to how we define these policies, but it's a helpful data point. Others, like a CES, came in at 2 to 4% above business as usual, but they drive job creation and economic development for the state. What's more, the CES costs are highly sensitive to those renewables assumptions I mentioned, which explains the range. For instance, there's a 40% difference in systems costs for a CES, depending on whether the payback period for new renewables is 20 years or 30 years. Next slide, and my final slide. Circling back to the start of the presentation, those CEP targets, that 2030 CEP target of 70% below 2005 levels by 2030. Based on the way we defined each of the policies we studied, the policies on this list met or exceeded that target in at least one of the 2 power sector models we used. Coal retirements also get you very close. In addition, the push policies like coal retirements and RGGI get you much deeper reductions in state by 2030. The policies listed here meet the target when you also include imported emissions. You might ask, if the CES, for instance, does it alone, why would you contemplate combinations? This is about those long-term trajectories and getting us on that carbon neutral path. Recall the push-pull conversation. So when you combine the pull policy of a CES with any of the push policies, it results in lower costs per ton of CO2 reduced and really gets you on that carbon neutrality pathway. This concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Kate, for the summary. We will make a copy of that report available digitally on through the Climate Change Council's web portal on the DEQ website. Again, when that's available, we'll get that online so that that's available for the public to easily access. Sushma, with that, we'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Jeremy. I understand we only have 2 public comment signups, so we have time. Sharon, if it's okay, we take a couple of minutes to ask questions. So if anyone has any questions on Kate's presentation on A1 or Jess's presentation on B1, feel free to put that in the chat box while I go through some closing remarks. Okay. So letting the council know that we have a deliverable for each of the agencies. Under Section 9 of the executive order, we all prepared the risk assessment resilience plan. And out of that came 4 specific strategies where we're working towards. And one of that was each agency doing internal analysis and review on resiliency actions. So your agency resilience annual reports are due March 1st, 2021. If you need assistance or help, Marlena Byrne over at NCOR and Amanda Martin are are engaging with cabinet agencies to support them and provide advice if you need that. Secondly, as noted, there are 2 reports posted currently that you may want to go to, and one is the NERC process we just mentioned, but also the building energy consumption report under Section 8, where the EO80 required 40% reduction in energy consumptions from state buildings. That progress report is now posted, and we will organize a presentation during our May council meeting. And then finally, today's slides will be posted at the council website noted here, along with the full recording of the webinar. We're tentatively planned to meet again on May 26th. And if there are any ideas or thoughts on what the agenda topic sheet consists of, please feel free to contact any of us listed below.
Sushma, if I could just add to the first deadline, we're going to give agencies 1 more week on the March 1st deadline for the agency resilience status reports, and Marlena is going to be in communication with agencies about that that extension soon if she hasn't already.
Great, thank you. Matthew, are there any questions?
Sushma, it does look like there are a few questions in the chat. One question regarding the B1 presentation. If you're taking questions, are you concerned that there is no environmental or justice representation in the NCGA stakeholder group convened by the speaker?
I am not aware of who is in that makeup. I think that is something that folks that are involved may know. So I'm not unable to answer that question, who's actually participating in that effort.
Thank you. There's also a question for DOA. What about employees who work from home, and how will they charge vehicles?
That's a great question. That's something that we're addressing now, and we're looking into that as part of the whole infrastructure development question.
Thank you.
This is Jeremy. I'll just add to that the executive order calls for agencies to transition vehicles when feasible, and so our approach there is to really tackle low-hanging fruit first and find DOA working with state agencies to find vehicles where it sort of makes sense right now given those vehicle needs and current practices and current EV technologies. So vehicles that are charged at home isn't a category we're targeting right now because it involves some complexities like the questioner sort of raises. So we're aware of the issue, but we're trying to focus on some of the easier vehicles to transition at this point.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. There's also a question in the Q&A from an attendee, Micah Henry. Going back to the TCIP info, is there any idea of how the carbon cap program will affect fuel prices in North Carolina for consumers and motorists?
James Bradbury, are you still online? I wonder if you're able to address this question. He's saying he needs to be unmuted. Matthew, is that something you could help him with?
Yes, I just brought him as a panelist.
Thank you. I'm back. Apologies, I had to step away during the other presentations. So thanks for the question. So as I mentioned during the presentation, the projected carbon prices at the first year of the program would be about $6.50 a ton. If the full costs of those allowances, which the fuel suppliers need to hold, if the cost of those allowances are passed on completely to consumers, that translates to about 5 cents at the pump. There is also, there's uncertainty as to exactly what the carbon prices will be. So there's also something I didn't get into, but something called a cost containment reserve, which essentially if the market price goes above a certain level, additional allowances would be made available at auction, and that would help to maintain prices at a certain level and keep them from going above that. And that trigger price in the first year is just over $12 a ton, and they're around $12 a ton, I believe, and that translates to at the pump about 9 cents. So it's a long way of saying the price at the pump would range in the first year between 5 and 9 cents per gallon if the fuel suppliers pass on the full cost to consumers.
Great, thank you. Additional question in the Q&A from the audience from Nick Jimenez. What are the state's next steps on the A1 report once final is presented to Governor Cooper?
So on that, yeah, we anticipate once we receive the A1 report, obviously read through it to make sure we understand it, anticipate hearing stakeholder input on the various policies and policy designs that are analyzed, and then we'd use that information to determine any next steps.
Thank you, Jeremy. I don't see any additional questions being shared either in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm sorry, there is actually one more. Jessica, for the competitive procurement in Colorado, were there any restrictions on the types of generation that was eligible? For example, no coal, or was it wide open? This question from Francisco Benzoni.
Yes, there were restrictions. Well, there's always some parameters that sort of dictate the types of resources that can participate in competitive procurement. For example, to date, we haven't seen a whole lot of competitive procurement that allows demand side resources to compete. That is changing. I do believe in the Colorado example, coal was either not allowed to participate or didn't participate. The other restrictions were that the resources had to be larger than 100 kilowatts. And there were some requirements around dispatchability as well. So there are, generally speaking, parameters or restrictions that go into all of these procurements.
Thank you, Jessica. And if there are no further questions, we'll go on to the two public commenters who have registered, if that's all right with the board. The first person who is registered is Michael Waddle, followed by Nicholas Jimenez. And since there are just two of you, we'll give you 3 minutes for your comments. If you'll please keep them under 3 minutes. Thank you. Mr. Waddle. Matthew, have you been able to unmute him?
Yes, ma'am. I made everybody able to unmute.
Mr. Waddle, if you're there and would like to provide your comments to the council. Michael Waddle. Okay, not hearing any comments from him. We'll go on to Nicholas Jimenez. Are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to comment. I just wanted to say a few things. First, I want to say thank you to all of the members of the Interagency Council for doing this work. It's just so exciting and kind of a relief to see the state taking action on climate change. And I know it's been a lot of work, and it's just really valuable. And I want to extend that to the academic members who led the A1 report: Kate Konchnick, Martin Ross, Jen Weiss, Jonas Manas. As a member of one of the A1 work groups, I've just seen them put in tremendous hours over the past more than a year to pull this together, and they've just done excellent work. So I wanted to say that, and then as most of the panelists are probably aware, we at the Southern Environmental Law Center filed a petition for rulemaking with the Environmental Management Commission on behalf of Clean Air Carolina and the Coastal Federation, asking for a rule that would set a state budget for carbon dioxide emissions from the electric power sector and have us participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So I just wanted to say a few words about that. The first thing is that we see that as really complementing the A1 process. Taking action on climate has been urgent for a while now, but it is only getting more urgent. And this is something that we believe that the state can move on now. It does not exclude some of the other solutions. As Kate mentioned, doing more than one thing can be a good idea. They can complement each other. But this is one that there's executive authority to move on now under existing law. And, not to steal the thunder from the final report, but just to hint at, some of the conclusions, it will be very effective. It was not on Kate's list of policies that achieve the clean energy plan goal on their own, but it comes very close. And it does that for very little money. It was by quite a bit the cheapest option out there. So we think this is really an easy decision to move on, and I just want to emphasize that we need to move on it quickly. The process for taking these actions it can be pretty long, and we're just running low on time. As you all are probably
Thank you, Mr.
familiar,
Jimenez.
Okay.
That's your 3 minutes. I appreciate it. Mr. Waddle, are you still online, and would you like to make your comments? Michael Waddle. Okay, we're not able to hear him. So Sushma, that concludes the public comments.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to open the floor to ask the council members to see if they would like to say anything or make any closing remarks. Hearing none, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jeremy, for facilitating the sessions. With that, we will close and meet again in May. Remember, if you need anything, feel free to contact any of us as we proceed. Have a good morning. Day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.